The silence in the house was broken only by the distant sound of suitcases being dragged through the door. Mrs. Teresa, a 60-year-old woman, watched her daughter, Clara, pack the last of her things before leaving. Her eyes were full of tears that she struggled to hold back. Clara didn't seem to hesitate. Her face was firm, determined. "It's better this way, Mom," Clara said, her voice cold as a blade. She said goodbye to her 2-year-old son, Pedro, without shedding a single tear. It was as if the decision to leave her child behind was as simple as choosing a destination for her trip. Mrs. Teresa felt something break inside her at that moment. She wasn't just losing her daughter to a distant dream abroad. She was being forced to take on the role of a mother once again, at a time in her life when she no longer had the same energy. Yet, looking at little Pedro, who innocently played with his toys, unaware of what was happening, she felt a new purpose blossom within her. Pedro was now everything to her, and she knew she could never abandon him, even though her own daughter had. When Clara finally closed the door behind her, the weight of loneliness settled over the house. Mrs. Teresa picked Pedro up in her arms, feeling the softness of his skin and the warmth that would keep her going. But deep down, a nagging doubt took hold. Would Clara ever come back to claim the son she abandoned? The doubt gnawed at her. But Teresa, with a heavy heart, knew she had to find strength. Still, she couldn't foresee what the future held for them, nor the devastating impact of Clara's unexpected return years later. The first few months after Clara's departure were the hardest. Mrs. Teresa had already raised her children, had already gone through sleepless nights and the struggles of motherhood. But now, at 60, it was all starting over. Pedro, so young and innocent, needed constant care, and Teresa, despite her tired body, did everything she could. She got up in the middle of the night, made bottles, and when exhaustion felt overwhelming, she looked at Pedro's smiling face and found her strength renewed. He was her new reason for living. The years passed, and the bond between grandmother and grandson only grew stronger. Pedro, who had no memory of his mother, called Teresa Mom without even realizing it. Every time she heard that, a mix of sadness and joy filled her heart. She knew Pedro was just filling the void left by Clara's absence, but at the same time, she knew what they had was real. It was true love. Teresa was always there for him, his first words, his first steps, and all the important moments of childhood. They were inseparable. But deep down, Teresa lived with a silent fear that followed her every happy day. The fear that Clara would come back. Since the day she left, Clara had never called, never sent a letter, or even a penny to help with expenses. She lived abroad as if she had never had a child or a family. For Mrs. Teresa, this was a mix of relief and pain. Complete abandonment seemed like the best option, as it meant Clara wouldn't interfere with Pedro's upbringing. But the silence was also an open wound. What if, one day, Clara decided she wanted Pedro back? Mrs. Teresa's life wasn't easy. Retired, she lived on a tight income that barely covered the house expenses and what Pedro needed to grow up. But Teresa never complained. She had decided to raise her grandson and would do whatever was necessary. On the toughest days, she took cleaning jobs in the neighborhood to earn some extra money. She scrubbed floors, washed clothes, always in silence, bearing the pain of exhaustion and the occasional humiliation that came with it. She did everything for Pedro. Teresa's other children helped as much as they could, sending care packages from time to time. But that help was never enough to cover all their needs. And besides, they hadn't forgiven Clara for leaving them in this situation. They judged their sister, but also their mother, for accepting to carry this burden alone. "You should have left Pedro with his mother. She made her choice, Mom, and you should have let her face the consequences," her children would say, always in the same critical tone. Teresa just listened, tired but firm in her decision. She knew that if she hadn't taken Pedro in, he would have grown up without the love and care a child deserves. Pedro, even at a young age, understood more than anyone imagined. He listened to the conversations in silence, his heart heavy, but never said a word. He knew how much his grandmother was suffering for him, and that filled him with deep love and gratitude. She was everything to him. Every sacrifice she made, every criticism she received, only made Pedro love his grandmother more. He saw in Mrs. Teresa a strength no one else had, and for that, he loved her more than anything. She was the only mother he knew, and he would do anything to repay the love she gave him. As the years went by, Pedro grew up, and now, at 13, he was no longer the innocent child who only sought comfort in his grandmother's arms. He was beginning to feel the deeper pains that his childhood had left behind. The abandonment by his mother was a shadow that always followed him. On Mother's Day at school, Pedro felt different from his classmates. He never got to bring Clara, and that saddened him more than he could express. While his friends posed for pictures with their moms, he stood alone, pretending not to care. But deep inside, he wondered why his mother never came back, why she never looked for him. Mrs. Teresa, on the other hand, always tried to fill that void, but she knew she couldn't completely replace Clara. Her heart ached seeing Pedro suffer, and she feared that as he grew up, he would become bitter toward the world because of the mother who abandoned him. Pedro's friendships started to worry Teresa. Some of the boys he hung out with were troublemakers, and she feared he would be influenced by them. But the love Teresa always showed Pedro kept him from going down the wrong path. Even with all the sadness he carried, Pedro didn't let anger or bitterness take over. His grandmother was the only person he truly trusted, and he clung to her love as his safe haven. Now older, Pedro also had a better understanding of the difficult situation his grandmother was facing. Seeing the sacrifices Teresa made to keep them afloat, he decided he could no longer be just a burden. He started looking for small ways to earn money, running errands at the corner store, delivering newspapers, anything to help with the household expenses. He wanted to repay, in some way, everything his grandmother had done for him. The bond between the two grew stronger every day, and despite everything he had lost, Pedro knew he had something more precious than most: the unconditional love of Mrs. Teresa. On the other side of the ocean, Clara lived a life most could only dream of. Married to a European millionaire, she spent her days attending lavish parties, traveling to the most exotic places, surrounded by glamour and wealth. Photos from vacations on paradise islands, dinners at fancy restaurants, and extravagant gifts were part of her routine. But at night, when the party's thrill wore off and the loneliness of the night crept in, Clara felt something that no jewel or trip could take away. A deep emptiness haunted her. The nights were the worst. Clara would wake up in the middle of the night, restless, with the image of a boy she barely knew. Pedro, the son she left behind more than a decade ago. Despite all the luxuries surrounding her, Clara couldn't escape the ghost of her decision. She had abandoned Pedro, and it haunted her in her dreams. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the face of a child looking at her, as if asking, "Why did you leave me?" And no matter how much she tried to ignore it, Clara knew she had to face what she had done. No party or trip could make her forget the child she had left behind. That's when, on one of those sleepless nights, Clara made a decision that would change everything. She looked at her sleeping husband beside her, took a deep breath, and decided it was time to return to Brazil. She wanted Pedro back. She thought that, with her money, she could fix the mistakes she had made. Rich and powerful, Clara believed she could simply return, take her son, and bring him to her new life in Europe, offering him the luxury and comfort she now had. In her mind, she believed Pedro would forgive her and accept this new life with open arms. Clara was about to find out that the past couldn't be erased so easily. Clara's return to Brazil was as sudden as her departure years ago. After being gone for so long, she returned, carrying suitcases full of designer clothes and the shine of a luxurious life that seemed untouched by time. But behind the dark sunglasses and sparkling jewelry, Clara had a darker purpose: to reclaim Pedro. The shock of stepping back into the country she had left so long ago was overshadowed by the nerves of reuniting with the son she had abandoned. When Clara arrived at Mrs. Teresa's simple house, the contrast between their two lives was glaring. While Clara stepped out of a luxury car with the same confidence that her life of parties and wealth had given her, Mrs. Teresa, with her body bent by time and exhaustion, could hardly believe what she was seeing. Clara, the daughter she had given up waiting for, was there, standing in front of her as if nothing had happened. Clara smiled, but her gaze couldn't hide her true intention. "I've come to get Pedro, Mom. I think it's time for him to see the world I can offer him." Teresa's world seemed to collapse at that moment. For 15 years, she had fought with all her might to raise Pedro, sacrificing everything so he could have a dignified life filled with love. And now, Clara, with her cold arrogance, thought she could just show up and take the boy away, as if he were a possession she had left behind. Teresa's heart raced, and she tried to stand firm. "He's my son now, Clara. You abandoned him. He doesn't even know you." But Clara was unyielding. She believed that with her wealth and new lifestyle, she could offer Pedro what Mrs. Teresa never could: a life of luxury. Little did she know, Pedro wasn't for sale. Clara stepped into Mrs. Teresa's home with an immediate sense of discomfort. The simple, humble environment was a stark contrast to the world of luxury she was used to. The smell of simple food, the faded walls, and the old couch in the living room were reminders of a past Clara had tried to bury. She looked around with a mix of unease and restlessness. "Where's Pedro?" she asked, trying to mask her discomfort, but her tone already revealed her anxiety. "He's at school," Mrs. Teresa replied, her voice low. Clara nodded, unable to sit down. She paced around the small room, her expensive heels echoing on the worn floor. When she finally settled on the couch, the old, sunken fabric made her feel even more out of place. She tried to hold back her nervousness, but the feeling of being trapped in a place so far from the life she had built abroad suffocated her. Clara stood up again, restless. She walked around the house, looking at the old photos of Pedro scattered on the walls. Each glance at those pictures was a stab of guilt that she refused to admit. Time seemed to drag on until, finally, the front door opened. Pedro walked in, sweaty from the walk home from school, and froze when he saw the woman standing in the room. She was so different, so out of place. She was a stranger in the familiar space. Pedro didn't know what was happening, but his heart sank when he saw the troubled look on his grandmother's face. Clara didn't wait. She stood up, her heels clicking in the small space, and quickly approached Pedro. "Pedro," she said with a calculated smile, "I came back because I want you to come with me to Europe. I'm your mother. There, you'll have opportunities you'll never have here." Mrs. Teresa stayed still, her eyes fixed on the floor, as if frozen in time. She had feared this moment, but hearing the word she had dreaded was like a blow that paralyzed her. Pedro, on the other hand, was in shock, even though he knew, somewhere deep in his mind, that this day would come. Hearing it out loud left him speechless. Everything seemed to spin. The idea of leaving the grandmother who had raised him was simply impossible. "I already have everything I need here, with my grandmother," he replied, his voice shaky but determined. Clara was surprised, but her expression quickly turned into one of frustration and stubbornness. She hadn't imagined that Pedro would reject her so firmly. Despite this, her determination only grew. Clara was no longer the young woman who had abandoned her son. Now, she believed she had the means to offer him a bright future, and she was determined not to give up. Pedro didn't wait to hear anything else. As soon as Clara's words spread through the room like poison, he turned his back and ran to his bedroom. The sound of the door slamming echoed through the house. Inside, he collapsed on the bed, his chest tight as tears rolled down his face. He had always wanted to meet his mother, always imagined what it would be like. But nothing matched what had just happened. He felt the world collapsing around him, as if all the certainties he had were suddenly ripped away. Between sobs, he muttered to himself, "I don't want to talk to her. I don't want to leave." In the living room, the silence was heavy. Clara, with frustration written all over her face, stood up abruptly. "I'm leaving, but know that I'll be back to get him," she said, her tone cold, like a promise. Without waiting for a response, she left the house, her heels marking each step on the floor. Mrs. Teresa watched her daughter disappear through the door, but her mind was focused on Pedro. Her heart broke, hearing her grandson's muffled sobs in the bedroom. Teresa carefully opened the door and stepped into the dark room, where Pedro was curled up on the bed. Without saying a word, she sat down beside him and hugged him tightly. They cried together, sharing a pain that words couldn't explain. Pedro had always imagined, deep in his heart, the day he would meet Clara, but he had never thought it would be like this, so full of anguish. Between tears, he whispered, "I really wanted to meet my mother, Grandma, but not like this. I don't want to leave you." Teresa, her eyes filled with tears, gently stroked his hair, feeling the despair in every shaky breath. "You'll never leave me, Pedro. I'm here, I'll always be here," she replied, her voice breaking. But she knew deep down that Pedro had many questions, many doubts about the past. He wanted to understand why his mother left him, why she never looked for him before, but at the same time, he couldn't imagine a life away from the grandmother who raised him with so much love. The conflict inside him grew, and the fear of losing his grandmother consumed him. In that embrace, they sought strength from each other, but the battle ahead was only beginning. The next day, Clara returned. She didn't want to waste time. Brazil was just a brief stop in her glamorous life in Europe. Every minute away from her parties, travels, and fancy dinners irritated her, and her patience was quickly running out. This time, she entered the house with the same coldness and determination. Mrs. Teresa's body trembled when she saw her daughter again, knowing that another battle was about to begin. The arguments between mother and daughter intensified. "You can't stop me, Mom. Pedro is my son, and I can give him what you never could," Clara shouted, her voice full of impatience. "You abandoned him. How can you think that after 15 years, you can just show up and take him away as if nothing happened?" Teresa retorted, trying to hold back the tears and the pain that was choking her heart. But Clara showed no remorse. Every word she spoke only revealed how much she saw Pedro as something she could simply reclaim. Pedro, in his room, heard everything. His heart was in pieces. He had never felt so confused and so angry. With each word Clara spoke, he felt more distant from her and closer to his grandmother, the only person who had been with him his whole life. Clara seemed to want to take him away from everything he knew, and he couldn't understand how a mother could do that. The argument grew more heated by the minute until the sound broke something inside him. Suddenly, the sound of something falling echoed through the house. Pedro ran to the living room and found Mrs. Teresa collapsed on the floor, her face pale and her breathing shallow. Pedro's heart raced. "Grandma," he shouted, desperate. Clara, paralyzed for a moment, quickly grabbed her phone and called for an ambulance, but the damage was already done. The stress, the pain, the years of struggle, all of it had finally taken its toll. In the hospital, Pedro never left his grandmother's side. The fear of losing Teresa consumed him. He knew, in his heart, that Clara was responsible for all of this. If she hadn't shown up, if she hadn't forced this situation, his grandmother wouldn't be lying there, fragile and on the verge of collapse. Clara tried to get close, but Pedro pushed her away in anger. "This is your fault. I'm never going with you," he shouted, tears streaming down his face. Clara stayed silent, feeling, perhaps for the first time, the impact of her actions. But despite Pedro's words, she was still determined to take him away, believing that time would fix everything. After the emotional explosion at the hospital, Clara disappeared. Neither Pedro nor Mrs. Teresa knew where she had gone. In the days that followed, a heavy silence hung over the house. Pedro, always by his grandmother's side, helped take care of her now that she was back home, recovering from the crisis. They believed the nightmare was over. For Pedro, Clara's absence felt like a victory. Maybe she had finally understood that he would never leave his grandmother. Teresa also tried to convince herself that it was all over. For the first time, she breathed a sigh of relief. But Clara, while she was away, reflected. For the first time in years, fear gripped her. The fear of losing everything, of losing Pedro, of never getting the chance to make things right with him, and of losing her mother too. This feeling was new to her, and it haunted her. Clara wanted her son, but she also realized that, in some way, she still cared about her mother, despite everything that had happened. During the days of silence, Clara vanished, deep in thought, trying to find a solution. Yet her determination remained. She wouldn't give up on Pedro. One morning, when the sun had barely risen, Mrs. Teresa and Pedro were having breakfast in silence, both trying to forget the dark days they had just been through, when the sound of a car pulling up in front of the house broke the moment. Teresa went to answer the door, and when she opened it, her heart nearly stopped. A court officer stood there, holding an envelope in his hands. "Mrs. Teresa, I have a court summons for you." Teresa took the envelope with trembling hands, and Pedro, realizing what was happening, rushed to her side. Clara had filed a lawsuit to take custody of Pedro. The calm they thought had returned was now replaced by an even bigger storm. The news devastated them both. Clara hadn't given up. In fact, she was more determined than ever. Teresa knew this wouldn't be easy. A legal battle was something she never thought she'd have to face, especially at her age. Pedro, with a heavy heart, couldn't understand how his mother could take things this far. "She can't take me away from you, Grandma. She can't," he said, his eyes filled with tears. But now, the situation was out of their control. The legal battle was just beginning, and Clara was willing to use every resource she had. Teresa knew that Clara's money and influence would tip the scales, but at the same time, Pedro was determined. He wouldn't let his mother take him away from the grandmother who had raised him with so much love. The fight for Pedro's future would be fought in court, where a lifetime of love and sacrifice would face the cold, calculated determination of an absent mother. Clara believed that money and power were on her side. She hired the most expensive lawyer she could find, someone who promised to resolve the case easily, convinced that with her influence and the right resources, victory was guaranteed. Clara was confident she could take Pedro with her to Europe, to the luxurious life that was now part of her routine. While waiting for the trial, Clara planned how her son's life would be, enrolled in elite schools, traveling the world. In her mind, money would fix the mistake of years of absence. The day of the hearing finally arrived, and the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Mrs. Teresa, though frail and weak, was there, with Pedro by her side. She knew this battle was more than legal. It was emotional. It was about who had truly been a mother to Pedro all those years. Pedro, sitting next to his grandmother, held her hand tightly. His heart was racing, but he knew what he had to do. He would never let Clara take him away from the woman who had raised and loved him. When the time came, Pedro was called to testify. The silence in the courtroom was heavy, all eyes on the young boy. Pedro took a deep breath, looked at Clara, then at his grandmother. He didn't have to think twice. "I want to stay with my grandmother," he said, his voice firm but full of emotion. "She's all I know. She's the one who raised me, who's been there for me in every important moment of my life. I'm grateful for everything she's done, and I love her more than anything. I don't want to leave my grandmother. I want to stay with her forever." Pedro's words echoed through the courtroom, and Clara, who had believed she could win her son back with promises of a better life, felt the ground fall from beneath her feet. The tension grew as everyone waited for the verdict. The judge, after hearing both sides, looked at Pedro and Mrs. Teresa with understanding eyes. He saw the sacrifice of the grandmother and the evident love between her and her grandson. When the decision was announced, the courtroom fell silent. Custody of Pedro would remain with Mrs. Teresa. Clara was devastated by the decision. All the power and money she thought would be enough to win the case couldn't buy the love Pedro felt for his grandmother. Without another word, Clara lowered her head, realizing that she had lost, not just in court, but also the chance to win back her son. After the verdict, Pedro ran into Mrs. Teresa's arms, hugging her with all the love and gratitude he had always felt. She, despite being sick and tired, felt a renewed strength. The love between grandmother and grandson was stronger than any hardship. With a weak voice, Teresa smiled at Pedro and said, "I always knew you'd stay with me." Pedro, emotional, squeezed her hand and replied with determination, "And I'll take care of you forever, Grandma." Clara returned to Europe with a heavy heart. For the first time, the victory of money and power felt empty. Sitting in her luxurious apartment, surrounded by everything the material world could offer, Clara felt miserable. She realized the time she had lost, the wrong choices she had made, and more than that, she realized the cruelty of trying to take Pedro away from the woman who had raised him with so much love. The sleepless nights were endless, filled with regret. That's when she decided to write a simple email, but sincere, asking for forgiveness from her mother and son. In the email, Clara poured out her heart. She admitted her mistake in leaving, in trying to fix everything with money and power. "Mom, Pedro, forgive me. I know I was wrong. I don't want to separate you anymore. I want to be part of your lives, somehow." The words were written with tears, but silence was the response. Neither Pedro nor Mrs. Teresa replied. Distrustful of Clara's intentions, they didn't know if she had really changed. Without giving up, Clara wrote other emails, always without a reply. But something inside her had changed. She wanted to truly try. And one day, Clara made the decision to return to Brazil, not to take Pedro, but to ask for forgiveness. When she knocked on the door of the simple house, Clara arrived humbly, without the luxuries of before, only with the desire to be heard. Sitting on the couch where it had all begun, Clara confessed her sleepless nights, the weight of guilt, and her sincere regret. "I don't want to separate you anymore," she said. "I want to be part of your lives if I can. I don't want to take anything away. I just want to make the most of the time we have left." Pedro and Mrs. Teresa listened, still wary, but something in Clara's eyes showed sincerity. Slowly, they accepted her words. They started doing small things together. A walk in the park, an ice cream at the corner store, and Clara even wanted to visit Pedro's school. She met his teachers, saw his classmates, and for the first time, felt proud of the son who had grown up without her. She was genuinely sorry, and little by little, Pedro and Teresa began to believe in her change. Over time, Clara regained their trust. She returned to Europe, but this time, her visits to Brazil became frequent. She helped financially without invading their space. And finally, one day, Pedro and Mrs. Teresa accepted the invitation to spend a few days in Europe. The family's reconciliation was complete. There were no more resentments, just the acceptance that love, with time and effort, can heal even the deepest wounds. The air in Europe was different, fresh, but wrapped in a familiar warmth. Pedro and Mrs. Teresa walked hand in hand with Clara, admiring the streets that, until recently, belonged to a world distant and unreachable for them. Pedro looked at his mother with a mix of curiosity and renewed respect. The woman he had rejected not long ago now seemed like someone willing to rebuild herself, to be part of his life without taking anything away from his grandmother. Teresa, her body more tired, but her heart lighter, looked at Clara with new eyes, a lost daughter who had finally found her way back home. One day, as they strolled through a quiet park, Clara stopped walking. Her tear-filled eyes met Pedro's and Teresa's. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to make up for all the wrong I've done, but I want you to know that you two are everything to me now. You've saved me from the empty life I was living," she said, her voice trembling. Pedro squeezed his mother's hand, and for the first time, felt that her hand no longer wanted to take him away, but to guide him closer. Mrs. Teresa, with tears in her eyes, looked at her daughter and said, "The greatest victory you can have isn't taking us from here, Clara. It's being here with us." They hugged, and for a few moments, time seemed to stop. 3 generations, once separated by an ocean of hurt and abandonment, were now united, not by money or promises, but by something far greater: forgiveness. Pedro, through his tears, looked at his grandmother, and then at Clara, realizing that he no longer had to choose. The family was finally complete. And in that moment, Pedro realized that just as his mother had found her way back, he too would find his future. Above all, he promised to take care of his grandmother, just as she had taken care of him all his life. The pain, the abandonment, everything dissolved in the power of the love that grew there in that very moment. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment below. Which part of the story moved you the most? The forgiveness, the unconditional love, or Clara's transformation? We'll continue bringing you stories that inspire and make us reflect on life and what truly matters. See you in the next video.